We are excited this afternoon to have this conversation because it is very relevant and poignant to present and existing conditions that exist. I just want to read something before I introduce the panel. And it says that the United States of America is experiencing an unprecedented crisis as a result of the current comprehensive immigration reform debate. As the nation struggles with deepening divides along political, ethnic, racial, and economic lines, we explore why immigration divides America. What is at the heart of the debate? What will it take to craft comprehensive immigration reform, and what are the solutions? And so that'll drive part of the discussion this afternoon. And we are really pleased and delighted to have our panelists here with us this afternoon to bring light to these issues. We want to have a responsive discussion here where we have good dialogue between those of you as well as our guest panelists. We're going to bring each one of them up and allow them, or from their seats, if you will, to have 5 minutes where they will give their opening remarks. And then after that, we will begin to have dialogue and discussion in this room in terms of the issue of immigration reform and its conditions here in the United States. So to my direct left, I'd like to introduce our guest panelists. First is Sonia Ayala, and she is a bilingual advocate at the YWCA Metropolitan Chicago Patterson and McDonald Family Center. So thank you for being here with us. And then next is Rocio Berceril, and she's an immigration attorney, and she has offices both in Chicago and the western suburbs. We thank you for joining us this afternoon. And then we have David M. Goldberg, who is a professor here at College of DuPage of Political Science. Thank you, Professor Goldberg. And then Sam Matrani, who is an associate professor of history at College of DuPage. And then finally, we have Catherine Norquist, and she's an immigrant legal services director at World Relief in DuPage. So we want to just encourage and thank our panelists for joining us this afternoon. As we move into our discussion, what I'd like to do is just start with Sonia and give them about 5 minutes in terms of opening remarks as it relates to the discussion that we are crafting here this afternoon.
Thank you. So again, my name is Sonia. I'm one of the advocates at the YWCA. I primarily work in DuPage County, and I primarily serve undocumented victims of crime, primarily Latino, Spanish-speaking only. So I think for the past 3 years at the Y, have worked with immigration heavily because of the families that I serve. So on top of the sexual violence that these families face, they're also undocumented, and it is an extreme hardship because a lot of the families are working 2 to 3 jobs. They make less than minimum wage, are working in terrible conditions, and are trying to move forward with their lives and move past the trauma that they have faced. So it is my job to serve these families by educating them, by providing them resources and referrals to immigration organizations as World Relief is a huge resource to us, where they're able to apply for a U visa, which will help them seek legal employment and will benefit their daily lives.
Thank you, Sonia. Rocio, let's hear from you for a few minutes.
My name is Rocio Berceril, and I am an immigration attorney. I see and speak a lot of my clients on a daily basis, and they are, they come with different stories that come from different parts of the world. They're here, a lot of them are mixed families where they may have, the spouse might be undocumented, or the children might be undocumented. Maybe 3 of them were born in Mexico and the other 2 were born in the United States. So you have a lot of these mixed families that are constantly being taken advantage of, especially when new immigration announcements are made. Scammers come out of the dark and they're asking for $1,000 for something that doesn't even exist. There are benefits that are not even in place yet. So there's a lot of confusion, there's a lot of misinformation out there. So my job is when people come to me, if they marry a U.S. citizen, I'm able to fill out the paperwork, the application, if there's a visa available for them to be able to apply. Now, a lot of times what we're facing is a lot of backlogs. So right now, the way our immigration system is, if I am a U.S. citizen and I submit a petition, I want to do it the legal way, and I want to bring my brother or sister, my sister has to wait 20 years before a visa is even available for them to be able to come to the United States. So when people say, oh, why don't they just come here the legal way? Why are they, cutting the lines? Why are they coming here undocumented? I tell people, well, they probably prefer to cross the desert 3-5 days, encountering rape or whatnot versus waiting those 20 years. So there's just, being knowledgeable as to like really what are the laws, what's out there. I think it's just what really needs to come out, and a lot of changes need to be made. I help my clients, like I said, if they're a U.S. citizen, if they're victims of a crime, I also do the U visas, if they want to renew their green cards, if they want to become citizens. So there are just a lot of things, and that Congress can do to be able to change the laws and regulations that are currently pending, that a lot of them, they're really not working effectively as they should.
Thank you, Roselle. Professor Goldberg?
So I want to thank Stephanie Quirk and David Swope and their staffs and offices for organizing this panel, as well as the Latino Outreach Center. So I want to talk, at least in part, about the political process, but I think the larger context in which the political process is embedded is really important. So I think borders are socially constructed, right? The borders exist in part because they're created by people through negotiation or war, conflict, compromise, however that works. There are reasonable reasons to have borders that could have to do with trade, national security. There are also borders that are not socially constructed. The Alps, the Andes, those are geographical features that exist and sometimes delineate between nation states. Having said that, I think that borders are very much a political entity. Borders play a role in the construction of national identity, and for me, I think immigration and the debate, or what passes for debate in this country at the current time around immigration, is as much about national identity as it is about anything else, and specifically the changing nature of national identity. So I will not presume to be a good historian, since that role will be filled by Professor Matrani, but I would say, if you think about U.S. history, the U.S. southern border is largely the result, and the Southwest is largely the result of a war between the United States and Mexico that was resolved in 1848 in a treaty by which the United States, for $15 million, seems like a bargain today, right, got New Mexico, Arizona, part of Colorado, most of California. So from the perspective of the United States, that significantly changes national identity. It opens up the West Coast and changes the myth and the reality of what we think about ourselves. From the perspective of Mexico, it changes their national identity as well, and how they might resent that or feel good, bad, or indifferent about the construction of those borders. Regardless, they lost a lot of territory. The United States gained a lot of territory. As I said a minute ago, I think the discussion about immigration is less about policy and how it could be fixed, because that's, I would argue, not that difficult. There were bills under a Senate bill under President Obama. It was very similar to a Senate bill that was introduced under President Bush after he won re-election, that were very similar in content. They were a long way from perfect, no doubt about it. They were seriously flawed, but they were at least the federal government addressing the crisis and dysfunctional nature of immigration policy in the United States. And those fixes are the kinds of things in terms of a pathway to citizenship, in terms of the kinds of things that were done in 1986, which was the last time that we had comprehensive immigration reform, which was under President Ronald Reagan, where 2.7 million undocumented folks were given the opportunity to apply for green cards. So think about how far that debate has shifted, that you're talking about President Reagan, who oversaw that comprehensive immigration reform, and how the core parameters of that and the core parameters of those Senate bills that I mentioned are untouchable, are electric in a sense in terms of a serious debate about policy today. So when we think about the status of the approximately 11 million undocumented people that are in this country, this discussion about a pathway to citizenship or permanent residency or a working visa, some legal status obviously is key. Why is it key? Because people do not have any legal rights if you're undocumented and your contractor decides that they don't want to pay you that day. You have no recourse. So regardless of partisanship or ideology, I think everyone can admit that people who are doing work should be paid, and they should have some recourse to go to the government or go to the courts or go to their employer and make a case for what they're owed. But again, I think in a larger sense, this is less about policy than it is about national identity. And so to support that, I would argue, this is a quote from the Pew Research Center, and it's pewhispanic.org. I can provide the link if anybody wants to see it. It's about the changing face of the United States and what it means to be a citizen of the United States or a resident of the United States, regardless of one's legal status. So this quote says, "The country's overall population will feel the impact of these population shifts. Non-Hispanic whites are projected to become less than half of the U.S. population by 2055 and 46% by 2065. No racial or ethnic group will constitute a majority of the U.S. population. Meanwhile, Hispanics will see their population share rise to 24% by 2065 from 18% today, while Asians will see their share rise to 14% by 2065 from 6% today." So the face of the United States is changing, right? Literally the complexion, the language, the cultural practices around religion and gender and food and a million other things. And I think for some people that is threatening or challenging, and for other people that is an opportunity to embrace. And I think, to me, that explains at least part of the underlying anxiety and unwillingness to have a serious conversation about immigration in the country, because it means we have to have a serious conversation about race, and historically we've not done a really good job of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Goldberg. And next we'll hear from Associate Professor Sam Matrani.
So I want to start by saying quickly that I think that the nation state, in a moral sense, is completely illegitimate. Most people frame this debate in a moral way, like, oh, do people have the right to come here, or immigrants broke the law? I think there's no way you can really argue that, like, those 3 children of the family that you were talking about who were born in the U.S. somehow have more of a moral or human right to have the same rights as the 3 children born in Mexico. To me, that's just ridiculous. I think the nation state in general is illegitimate, and our long-term goal should be to abolish it. But in the meantime, that's not going to happen. So I think that historically, immigration in the U.S. has played different roles for different people. And I want to start by talking about the people who run this country, which are the business people who have all the money. And they generally have had 2 different interests in immigration, and these 2 interests in some ways on the surface work at cross purposes. For a long time, the business people who run the United States have wanted to bring people into the country as a downward pressure on wages and to find people who can work. This is what started when the cities were built in this country, starting right after the American Revolution. It expanded throughout the 19th century, and these immigrant groups have always come from many different places. In the 19th century, they invented the idea of white people. It really started in the 18th century, but okay. Then they decided that Irish people can be white, and Russians can be white, and Jews can be white. That's why Jews love being here, right? Because Jews are like the 10th most hated group. White people hate black people more, so Jews get to be white here. This is like one of the things about America, right? Bring people in, make them white people, fine. But the reason that they're brought in is to work. It's all about jobs. And this is, of course, threatening to the people who are here. And this leads to the second interest that rich folks have in immigration. And that is, it's a political way to distract from the problems that they cause working class people. You can start from the 1880s, when there was a push for the Chinese Exclusion Act. This is the first immigration reform in American history, which was to block Chinese people from coming in here. Why? They're stealing our jobs. Okay, well, the reality was they more or less finished building the railroads, they were laying people off, there's unemployment, and who's to blame? Well, it's not the employers, it's not the rich people who took all the money, no, it's the damn Chinese. And this has been a constant thread in American politics up to this day. So I actually slightly disagree with David. I don't think it's just about national identity. I think it's about the fact that today there's a lot of tension in this country over the fact that there really are structurally not enough jobs, and especially not enough jobs that pay enough. And since the mid-'70s, the standard of living for white and black people in this country has been going down pretty dramatically. So why? Well, the real reason, of course, is the rich people took all the money. But it's much easier to say immigrants stole our jobs. So what is the interest of those of us who aren't rich people in all of this debate? Well, I think the only way to stand up to this problem is for, in some way or other, ordinary people to organize and make a fight to demand jobs, to demand shorter hours, to demand higher pay. This country can absolutely afford it. And the only way you're going to do that is if people find a way to unite across these divides. So I think every single person in this country has an interest in demanding that every person here, from the moment they get here, has the complete, exact rights as everybody else. So I actually am completely opposed to those bills that David was talking about, because what they set up was like a 13-year pathway to citizenship, which in fact kept people in a second-class status, and set up like a new Bracero program where people are going to be really tied to their boss. I think what we need to demand, maybe we won't get it immediately, but we need to at least put on the table that the only thing worth fighting for is for full and immediate legalization of everybody here. Thank you.
Professor Matrani, thank you. And finally, we'll hear from Catherine Norquist.
Okay, thank you. So I have been at World Relief for the last 11 years. I direct our Immigrant Legal Services Department at our office in Wheaton and then also in Aurora. And so just to give you a little bit of background, in order to be able to assist someone with their immigration paperwork, their immigration history, give legal advice, you either need to be an attorney like Rocio, or you need to be accredited, have site recognition, which you can only get by being a 501c3 organization. It's essentially sort of a legal license through the Department of Justice. And so our site is accredited. We're actually the only one accredited in DuPage County and one of 2 in Aurora and one of 3 in Kane County. So the changing demographics of DuPage and Kane and the western suburbs, to have that few accredited organizations is kind of ghastly, right? So, and in essence, the goal behind giving site recognition is to provide quality immigration legal services that are accessible to immigrants without having to pay the high fees of the private bar. So if immigrants can't pay attorney fees for legal advice, that would be the role of an accredited organization. So we see on average, I have a team of 10. When I started there in 2004, we had a team of 2. And so we see about 4,000 to 5,000 immigrants a year. We do mainly family-based, family reunification, citizenship, green card applications, and then also the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA, that we have recently seen. So it's a very personal thing. When we talk about immigration, for me and my team, it's not this in theory, not that it isn't for you guys, but it's people, and lots of people that we've come into contact with. And so, and then also we are a refugee resettlement agency. Every year we resettle about 500 to 600 refugees from around the world. I know we're all hearing about Syria right now. We'll be starting to see a wave of them. But we often get challenged by folks in the community of, why are you bringing these people here from other countries? They're stealing our jobs. And we say, okay, well, most of the first job that we put most of our refugees who are documented from the day one are in meatpacking plants, or let me describe to you some of the jobs that they're doing. Is that a job that you and your friends that we're taking from you? And once you kind of have that conversation a little bit more, it kind of backs up a little bit. Oh wait, maybe I didn't want that job. It's also important to know that in our agricultural field, or agricultural sector, 70% of those working agricultural jobs are undocumented. And so if we're going to really take a hard line on let's deport everyone, then we're all going to have a food shortage issue. So I think it's a very complicated issue, and I think it does, I agree with my fellow panelists here about it has a lot to do with, what do I do with someone who doesn't look like me and speaks a different language from me? And I think the media has done a huge disservice in playing on people's fears and taking certain cases of individuals and obviously making them examples of, this is why we should be afraid of all immigrants, and drawing some sort of weird line that at some point, this is what an evil immigrant looks like. So anyways, thank you for letting me be part.
Thank you, Catherine. And so we see that this is a conversation that has a variety of different facets to it. And our goal here for these brief moments is to kind of explore. So we want to have an interactive exchange in terms of discussion. There's a lot that can be said and has already been said about immigration and reform. When I think about it in terms of what our country, what this country, what the government can do, and I'll just start by asking this question. What do you think that Congress can do in terms of immigration reform, in terms of how it relates to what we see, some of the issues that you guys presented in terms of, I would just use it this way, media stereotyping and those types of issues, and even to Matrani's points and some of his points of certain things that should or should not be legislated. What do you think that Congress could do to better help immigration reform here in America?
Can I just say first we need to start with a new one? I mean, I think it's incredibly difficult right now because everyone is so divided. I mean, we're so divided that our speaker stepped down, right? So, but I think there has to be some sort of agreement on just some basic things. And I think in one of the readings I did to prepare for this, because there's a lot of things we know, but then you kind of have to step back, but is really looking at this more from an economist perspective. Most economists will say we need to adjust our immigration laws to meet our economic demands. And that's a basic place. And I think that's a basic area where both sides of the aisle could agree on. And so if we could start there, and then also addressing that we haven't looked at the visa caps. The reason why it takes 20 years for a family member to come is because the caps for the visa categories were set in 1965. They were adjusted a little bit in 1990. But have we looked at addressing the supply and demand need of both our economic sector and then also the family-based visa categories?
Yeah, I think there's one interesting thing. I mean, I agree with you about getting rid of Congress, first of all. But if you're talking about this Congress, I think that in some ways the Republican Party is trapped because they, on the one hand, serve business, and there's a big push by a lot of big businesses to actually try to push some kind of immigration reform. Like I know Caterpillar, which I think is the biggest industrial employer in Illinois, really pushed for immigration reform, although what they want is something to turn people who are now undocumented into essentially indentured servants. But the Republican Party also plays on all this anti-immigration stuff. So I think one of the reasons why they're gridlocked is because they're caught between the two sides of their policy, which are essentially the two sides of the rich people's policies, which are using immigration as a scapegoat and also attracting immigrants to use them as workers. So these two things are contradictory, and it causes a big gridlock in Congress. As far as what this Congress can do, though, I would say, quit, jump off a bridge, I don't know, abolish the Constitution and get rid of the border and make a world that is just about people, but they're not going to do any of those things. So.
I agree. I think Congress right now, I feel like we're asking a broken home to fix an issue where I feel like within themselves they just can't. And I feel there's so many other issues where this bombing goes off in this other country, let's focus on that, and then just kind of leave immigration on the back burner. So I think for now, since I think Congress has to fix themselves first. That's just the first step before they can even start thinking about immigration reform. But I think initially now they could at least, I think they could fix whatever immigration, system we have right now. So like the visas that I was speaking about, having the huge backlog, I think right now they can at least try to, get those moving or going as much as possible, and then maybe trying to implement something based on that. But that's why I just feel it's just so hard to ask Congress right now to do something. I've had this debate with one of my close friends, and he always tells me, think of it from like an economic perspective. It's like, what is it in for me? So someone who has status is like, why should I help this person? Why should we do immigration reform? So then I was like, well, fine then. If it's through the, you're looking at this from the economic glass, then why don't you charge a fee? People are willing to pay coyotes or people who cross them over the border over $8,000 to come from Salvador, Guatemala, to cross the border. These are the fees that they pay so they can, I'll have an appointment with a client and they're like, oh, I'm here with my 8-year-old, but I have my 14-year-old, 15-year-old, 16-year-old back in El Salvador. And I'll ask them, why don't you bring them? Well, the coyote wanted to charge me $8,000 for each, and I could only afford to bring my youngest daughter with me. So if people are willing to really save like $8,000, and when you think about these poor countries just trying to come here illegally, and you come here through the most horrible ways you can just imagine. I mean, I hear just the most horrible stories, people trying to cross the border. So it's like, why not do it the legal way? And why not charge people $10,000 for a visa? I mean, this is just a silly thing that I've had these arguments with my friend, but it's like, fine, if it's an economic perspective and you want something from it and, do it the legal way, but say, okay, if you want to, immigrate, charge $1,000. If they're willing to do it and they're coming here illegally and they don't even have a visa or anything at the end, then, do some type of immigration reform where you charge them a certain amount of money and they come the legal way and they have some type of status. But anyways, it's just a small conversation I should have with my friend, just trying to come up with, a result to this whole immigration debate.
So I would just say, sort of briefly, that I think that the system that exists today is not is because people, you have to see who benefits from it, right? And I think Sam's touched on some of this. And so I think there's a political advantage to for people who are campaigning on this, to sort of press the issue and define the issue in a particular way. That's advantageous, and that's been advantageous for an awfully long time. My point is that the system is the way that it is. It's not as if it's a black hole and all sort of reason and logic are sucked into this and it makes no sense. It's the way that it is because there's a political explanation that someone benefits from running for office on this. And then the economic piece is something that I think everyone has alluded to, and that is we all get a tremendous discount in everything by using undocumented labor. If you're talking about the agricultural industry, if you're talking about the service industry, if we had to pay sort of what was fair market value, then the price of everything would go up. There's a built-in discount for exploiting the labor of undocumented people. But because the cost of living and wages are higher than in some of the countries that have been mentioned, people are still making enough money to send money back home to their family in some cases, while being below poverty in this country. So there are elements that, that are benefiting from keeping the system the way that it is. It's not inertia, it's protected interest, both politically and economically, and that's difficult to address. And I think, in spite of the comments about Congress, I think it's bipartisan. I think this really transcends easy ideological definition. I think there are a lot of people on a lot of sides who benefit from framing these issues in particular ways regarding race and ethnicity. And it's not just in the United States. I'm interested in what's going on in Haiti because the Dominican Republic, their Supreme Court basically passed a ruling that said that Haitians who come to work in the sugarcane fields in the Dominican Republic, that the Dominican Republic benefits from economically. Those Haitians they're basically stateless people. If you come from Haiti and you give birth in the DR and you work in the sugarcane fields, you have neither a Haitian passport nor Dominican statehood, and the Dominican Supreme Court just said, you have to leave now, and have said that repeatedly. What's that about? Well, there's a deep-seated animosity from the DR towards Haiti and violence associated with that goes back a long way. My point in mentioning that example is to say this is replicated in other places. The Syrian crisis is slightly different because of the civil war. There are different variables that are pushing that. But my point about national identity and these questions about economics, this is the same in plenty of other places. If you substitute undocumented Mexican for undocumented Haitian, you're talking about the same thing, and I'm sure we could find that in plenty of other places in the hemisphere and in other parts of the world. I think the point is to say, while we're talking about domestic immigration reform policy in the United States, it's difficult to divorce that from the fact that, by definition, immigration means you're transcending borders. It's by definition a global issue and a global problem. That's bigger than what Congress can do. But I think, as I said, the bill that I stated at the beginning the bills are extremely flawed, as Sam has pointed out, that they create like a two-tiered system in terms of labor, that people have rights, but they're basically, as you said, tied to their employer. I guess my response to that would be I wouldn't let the pursuit of the perfect get in the way of the possible. I would take, and these bills are crappy, to be frank, in terms of public policy. They're not good. But that compared to the kind of horror stories that people have been sharing about what it's like for a family, or what it's like if you're the victim of crime, that you have no rights, you have no legal standing. And so I think the enormity of that problem, to me, would lead me to sort of say, well, I guess in the short term I would be willing to accept a bill that is not very good policy, in the hopes that once you open that door, you can eventually move to accomplish a more fair and equitable discussion about public policy that might produce better outcomes. So it's kind of far-reaching, but I think, you got to think about not just Congress and what Congress can or can't do, but also the context in which this is occurring across the world, because it is everywhere. Thanks.
I agree with all the comments that were said. But I think from my perspective as an advocate, I know Rocio mentioned this as well. I think it would be also important to focus on the backlog on the U visas, because a lot of the families that I work with, I'm kind of the first responder. So I meet these families when they go to an emergency room because they were just sexually assaulted, or because they're seeking a civil no contact order or an order of protection, or they just need counseling services or support. So I really want to inform my undocumented families that this is something that they're able to apply for. And I have come into contact with some families where this crime happened years ago and they had no idea that this is something that they qualify for. So there's a lot of families that have gone through this trauma and don't know that it's their right to be able to apply for a U visa, or they might stumble upon one of Rocio's workshops, or they might have a friend or a family member that sought services at World Relief, so they hear it through there. So I think my role as an advocate, I'm able to kind of inform my clients from the beginning so they know that this is something that they could move forward with in the future if it is what they want.
And so, unless you want to say something now, Rocio, or did you say something earlier?
Oh, no.
Okay. But what we would like to do now is give you all an opportunity. What are your thoughts about some of the things that you've heard or some of the questions that you may have? There's some things that we can talk about, but we want to give you guys an opportunity to have an interactive discussion. Maybe hear from some of you all if there are experiences that you would share, or if you have questions for the panel, because what we want to be able to do is make this interactive so we can derive outcomes from this discussion. There's a lot to be said about it. There's more that can be said about the economic positioning of America and how the immigration impacts that, or its impact on men and women. Are those distinct differences in terms of how that impacts? But what are some of the things that you guys are perhaps thinking about, or questions that you may have for the panelists? Let's see if we can open up some interactive dialogue here.
So I have a question about countries being held accountable.
Excuse me, could you stand?
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
So maybe Sam or David, you guys could talk about the political and the historical reason that certain countries seem to have difficulty taking care of their people. So I'm totally in agreement with you, and I'm not going to try and say, like, our immigration problem is Mexico's fault. That's not what I'm saying, and I certainly wouldn't say that Europe's immigration problem is completely Syria's fault, but in my head, it seems weird that we can't hold other nations accountable for taking care of their people. Those people are willing to go through all sorts of crazy sacrifices and scary situations to get here, or to get to Europe, wherever it might be. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about the history of what's happened in Mexico, if we want to keep it domestic, and the political climate, and why people are willing to go through hell to get to the United States.
I mean, the short answer is that there are rich countries and poor countries, and the rich countries are the countries which, sorry, I can't hear it when I'm back here, so it sounds like it's not going through the microphone. The rich countries are basically those countries that stole the wealth out of the poor countries. They're the colonial powers. They're the countries which have invaded a bunch of other countries. I mean, the Syrian crisis is caused by the U.S. invasion of Iraq, bombing this country, killing maybe 1 million people, driving political instability throughout the entire region, right? ISIS is linked to people who the U.S. funded in 2007 during the surge, who then it turned against, and now it's supporting, this Shia group in Iraq, and so they moved into Syria. That country is destabilized. This is something which, start to finish, started with the U.S. invasion of Iraq. If we're talking about immigration into the U.S. from Central America, you're talking about countries which have been the U.S.'s backyard for 150 years. Let's take the Central American example, and I'm saying that because I drive on Ronald Reagan Expressway, so it pisses me off, right? Ronald Reagan funded a genocide in Guatemala and in Nicaragua. The people who did that were based in Honduras. These countries were completely destroyed. And then Obama backed a military coup in Honduras, and still backs it today, which made the situation even worse. Honduras has the highest murder rate of any country in the world. This is because the U.S. exported an enormous amount of violence to those countries, destroyed them, murdered hundreds of thousands of people, and made them unlivable. So people fleeing those countries are seeking a place where you can survive and get a job that pays you a little bit more, and you're not going to get killed by some death squad funded by Ronald Reagan. Okay, he's been dead for a while. Good riddance, but still.
I would sort of, I guess, go in a slightly different direction. I mean, in international relations, and people from my class that are here now will know, we talked about fragile and failed states. Some states or parts of states, like I don't think Mexico is a fragile state, but I think that there are states within Mexico that meet that definition, that are unable to perform the basic services that we associate with the nation state: an electrical grid, running water, something approximating paved roads, public safety, rule of law, stuff like that. That doesn't exist in many parts of the world, and Sam's comments about the United States notwithstanding, if you take the United States out of it, my example of Haiti and the DR, I mean, there are plenty of other places where this is still occurring. I think in terms of Mexico, I mean, the idea that we've ever had like a border with Mexico that wasn't porous is fiction, and most borders are that way. There's never been some concrete electrified barrier that keeps dark-skinned people out of Texas and New Mexico. Like, this is fiction, right? And the idea that it's gonna happen is fiction too. It's a polite fiction that people accept it. I think the argument is, the sort of neoliberal economic argument is, that's based on free trade with NAFTA, for example. The whole press for that was that if Mexico's economy grows and maquiladoras, big factories that are free trade zones, are able to create more opportunities for Mexicans, then they would be more likely to stay in Mexico. So I think there's sort of, in terms of that bilateral relationship, there's really two drivers. One is economic. And we know this because after 2009, there's a decline in the number of people that are undocumented that are in the country. There are people that are seasonal agricultural workers and a lot of other fields who went home because there were no longer construction jobs or the agricultural jobs had dried up. And that number goes down, and again, I can show you that information. So some of this is cyclical, and people have been moving to take labor to a place where it can get more for its return for forever and ever. So that's not necessarily new, but I do think the inequalities drive some of this. And this is the same thing even before the Syrian crisis, but in the EU, where you had people from Eastern Europe who were going to Western Europe, where if you're a carpenter or an electrician, you can make a lot more money in France than you can in Poland. So some of this stuff is almost universal, right? I think it's a question of how people get treated and the rights that people have and the standing that they have legally is important. The example that I gave in my class, I think that's kind of cool, is this artist, British artist Banksy, created this dystopian amusement park. Stay with me, this will make sense in a minute. And it was dystopian. It's called Dismaland, right? You can Google it. Now, why am I telling you that? Well, because after the Dismaland experiment ended, they took that apart and they used the building materials from Dismaland to create temporary housing for immigrants and refugees that are fleeing not just Syria, but other parts of Europe, in Calais, which is the primary port in France, to get to England, right? And I thought that was really creative and cool, a way to address that. Now, that's not systematic, and it doesn't address the kinds of serious problems that we're talking about, but it means that people are paying attention to that, and that people are unhappy with the status quo, and that people recognize that other human beings shouldn't be treated that way. So, I mean, I think those sort of like human truths, in a sense, are profound and they really matter, and we need to say them out loud more often, because it becomes more obvious, whether you're talking about U.S. relations with Mexico, Mexico relations with the United States, the countries in Central America or Europe or Syria. Some of these things are truths, right? So there are economic drivers of this, but as I said before, I think there are also political drivers of this that benefit. Someone benefits from this politically for very specific reasons, and we need to look at that and basically say that it's not okay, that these things are not acceptable, and to say that at the polling place, and to say that in terms of media consumption, and to say that on Twitter, and to say that at every available opportunity. And I think that doesn't address the sort of partisan issues that some other people were talking about, but it basically makes it an issue. And that's why I mentioned the Banksy thing, because he's an artist. And here he is taking on an issue, and that is there are people in Calais who don't have a roof over their head and their families, and they don't have adequate housing and access to clean water, let alone a minimum number of calories a day, and he's calling attention to that in a way that other people who might not otherwise care about that will suddenly pay attention because he's cool and hip, and it will garner attention. So I think creative ways to deal with that in the short term are one way to approach that that's a little bit more micro than addressing bilateral trade inequalities or the free trade system and everything that's associated with that. Ramble off.
Questions? Here.
I was interested in how the bill in Congress would change immigration in the U.S.
How the bill in Congress would change?
How does it address the issues that we're currently having?
Okay. You guys understand the nature of the question? Catherine, you want to?
Are you speaking about a particular bill right now?
Just in general, like, what are they addressing in Congress now?
Nothing.
Yeah.
So there were two, as I mentioned before, there were two Senate bills. What happened was some people in the House and the Senate wanted to take apart the fence security illusion from the other parts of the policy. So some people said instead of having comprehensive immigration reform that would address a lot of issues, that first they wanted to secure the border, which again I would argue is a polite fiction because there's never been a secure border and there's not likely to be one in the future. So that's meant that bill is dead on arrival. But the Senate bill that I mentioned under Obama and Bush was one that had several tiers. You have to pay a fine, not be convicted of a felony. Other people might be able to speak to this in more detail. Learn English, and then you could apply for a 3, 5, 7-year term and then reapply. So that was not a permanent fix at all, and I don't want to misrepresent it. But the fact that Congress would be taking seriously the fact that this is an issue that's not being addressed is at least a step in the right direction, and that step's now been taken back.
Right, yeah, different parts. The most recent one, it basically, depending on which category you'd fall into, it would take you about 13 years to ever realize citizenship and really easy to fall out of status. It also, the example that Rocio gave of if you're a U.S. citizen applying for a sibling, they went ahead and did away with that provision. So you could no longer apply for a sibling. It's called the fourth preference category. So that did away with that. I think in the bill, it also increased the caps too. I think they were trying to address that. And then 20 years ago, they had talked about trying to keep better tabs on who has come into our country legally and what is happening to their status, because as we know, it's something like 46% of all undocumented immigrants in the United States actually entered legally, but then overstayed their status. So, a part of these bills was also how to track sort of an exit system, if you will, of what's happened with those folks as well. So, but a huge portion of these bills was also enforcement related. So already the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, arm of the Department of Homeland Security has a humongous budget. And a lot of that was given more and more money, basically, to be patrolling our border and things like that. So, because in order to get anything passed, there has to be a huge enforcement component, which in 1986, when they passed what was called Reagan's amnesty, there wasn't a huge enforcement component. So you had a lot of people applying, but there wasn't as much going on in terms of what is this person's background and criminal activity and things like that. That wouldn't be the case now if there is any immigration bill that is passed, which is why it's important that there are good advocates and good people helping others apply for benefits, because it could be so easy to go ahead and send an application in for said immigration reform remedy or benefit, and then all of a sudden end up in deportation proceedings because of something that happened 20 years ago in your past. So I think that's also going to be really key moving forward, is the enforcement priorities that are embedded in these bills, which are also some of the most problematic.
Rocio, Sonia, do you all like to chime in on any of this in terms of this particular topic, or There's one other thing, if there's no other, we'll go out to other questions, but one thing I'd like to address maybe between the two of y'all to start is, we know that America is a very diverse nation. It's a country that's made up of a variety of ethnicities, cultures, heritages, and in its own way, it prides itself as a country in that type of freedom for, ethnic integration and those things. Do you think that the diversity componentry here in America is either helped or hindered by immigration reform, and if so, in what ways?
I think I think the United States is composed. Even people who come visit here, Chicago, they see so many ethnicities, so many groups. I think it's so diverse. So I think that has opened, having this type of a path for people to come to the United States, to be able to live here and reside legally, has opened the doors for a lot of different ethnicities to be able to come and reside here in the United States. So that has created a lot of diversity and different ethnicities living here. I think something, I wanted just to kind of point to some stuff you guys had mentioned. I almost feel like they're trying to make the people who are here undocumented illegally, they're trying to make them almost like a scapegoat for the problems that are currently going in the United States. Sometimes I feel like, sometimes you'll see examples or people reference back to what happened with Hitler, where he started pointing the finger at the Jews. They're the ones who are taking away our jobs. They're the ones who are taking away our, this is the reason why our economy is going down the toilet. This is why, we are where we are. So I feel like it's just like a finger for someone to be pointing at. And I feel like they just look or point at the weakest group or ethnic group that they have, which are the undocumented. And we're talking about, I was actually surprised to find that there are actually more undocumented that are Chinese than actually like Mexicans. I would think like Hispanics are the ones that are the largest group who are here illegally, but there are actually other ethnic groups that are here. So I think, being able to create some type of a correct path for people to be able to come here, definitely the backlog. That's the thing that's just holding a lot of people's options to be able to come to the United States legally and not have to wait 20 years. I think that's just holding back a lot of other people who could come here, because people come here, they do contribute. It's true right now, a lot of the presidential, candidates are, just focusing on the minor 2-3 groups, and they point or single out a group, or maybe someone has done something, and they're like, oh, this is how all Hispanics are. These are all how Mexicans are. But I think, if you really look at stories and you see people who come here to the United States are undocumented illegally, they're doctors. I mean, there is just the very first attorney, he's undocumented, and he got his law license. He's able to practice, and I can't remember if it was New York or California, where he was actually allowed to become an attorney, being undocumented. So you have a lot of really good stories where, people who come from different countries, different ethnicities, are able to come to this country and contribute a lot. And I think that's what people are not focusing as much, but they're just focusing on the weaker ethnic group. Let's point the finger at them. That's our scapegoat. Our economy is going down because of them. The bombing in other countries is because of them. And I just feel that they're diverting the wrong information just to the smaller, weaker group. And I just think if there were just a way for them to be able to create a better path, a better, fix what we have now and maybe fix in the future, would be a whole lot better.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the U.S. has been always viewed as the so-called melting pot, but I think the underlying issue has always been racism. And I think that a lot of the families that I work with that are undocumented, or even, as Rocio mentioned, that she works with a lot of mixed families, I also work with families that are mixed, they have status, that don't. And I think the way that they feel about being here in the United States is that they don't really fit in. So they're not really classified as being American, even though some of the family members were born here. I could give an example, I guess, for my family. My family migrated from Mexico in the late 80s, and my brother and I were the first generation students to be born here in the U.S., and I feel that because the way that the media presents immigration or undocumented individuals here, there's always kind of like an in-between for families that are mixed. It's not fully being a part of either country. So you're not necessarily a part of your home country because you weren't born there. Yes, you have roots because of your family, but you were born here, so you were raised on American culture. And because of racism, I feel that being here, being a person of color, at times doesn't classify you as being American or what people view as what America is supposed to be. So that's what I see a lot with families that I work with, not fully fitting in or not fully being a part of the culture here.
Hence the importance of the conversation in terms of gaining information. So we have a few more minutes. If there's other questions we'd like to hear from someone, okay, let's take a few more questions here. We go here, and then we'll go here. Yep.
I have a very question to ask all of you guys, the panelists. Now, there's this very country. Now, I know that the elections are approaching for next year, and I want to know something about, like, Donald Trump wants to deport all these 11 illegal undocumented immigrants. How would you go around that?
Are we answering Donald Trump questions?
I mean, yeah, you don't. It's the. Yeah, I mean, you're not the one proposing the policy, right? It's a non-starter. I mean, let's just be honest. This is not a partisan statement to say that's totally a non-starter. While he promises that it will be humane and that people will be happy, he's running for office. He's tapped into something, and I think, in spite of the silliness of this or the danger of it, depending on how you want to play it, good on Donald Trump for forcing us to have a conversation about immigration. Because if nothing else, there are lots of people that stand up and say, you want to do what? Like, how, as you're asking, how do you propose to accomplish that? I mean, it's not viable politically. It's not viable on the ground in terms of law enforcement. It's not serious policy. It's not a fix to immigration. It is a soundbite that has propelled him to the front of the Iowa caucuses. But I think anyone that takes immigration seriously or understands how many zeros are in 12 million would honestly say that's bonkers. That's just bananas. And the sooner that we stop pretending like that's a real policy and force policymakers on both sides of the aisle to be specific. It's not okay for the Donald or anyone else to say, I'm going to hire really good people, trust me, right? No, that's not an acceptable response. And when people start holding candidates for office accountable for bat guano policies, then we won't have that problem anymore, right? But he's tapped into something. And in spite of when we're talking about diversity, this is a very diverse room. You don't have to go too far away from here to see parts of the United States that are not diverse, racially, ethnically, economically, and those are places where that message resonates. I think you gotta bear that in mind. You may not like what Donald Trump or someone else is saying. He knows exactly what he's saying, and this is very well crafted, and this is poll tested and focus group tested, and he keeps saying it because it's working for him. But the short answer is it's not a real policy. It's not going to happen, and people that are serious about policy should be offended by that. But having said that, I would just reiterate, thank you, Donald, for forcing us to have a conversation about immigration, because the fact that everybody recognizes that that is bananas is the first step towards saying what would Congress do? What would Springfield do? What does government do in terms of dealing with first-generation college students and giving them in-state tuition, all those other policies that could be adopted and have been to a certain extent. So I think that's nuts, but it's also worth discussing why it's nuts.
I want to make actually a slight counter-argument, although 99% of me agrees with you, and I hope you're right. But there are actually two cases in relatively recent U.S. history when there have been mass deportations carried out within a lot of violence, when in fact many mixed families were deported. The biggest, which people totally forget about, is by FDR, the great liberal in the Depression. This is why I will never vote for a major party candidate since Ulysses S. Grant. He deported over 1 million people to Mexico. Most of them were actually not illegally here. They were people who had come here to work mostly in California and Texas. It was this huge program of mass deportation. Their children who were born in the U.S. were deported. In fact, he had the balls in World War II to mail the children who were U.S. citizens draft notices in Mexico to where he deported them to. He rounded up literally 1 million people, almost as many zeros as 11 million, deported them to Mexico, and like, you got a draft notice in Monterrey, like, oh, you're a U.S. citizen because you're born here, even though we deported you. You have to show up for the draft in Texas. That's pretty crazy. The other time is in the 40s and 50s, in an operation that the U.S. government literally called Operation Wetback, where they deported about 3.5 million people. The numbers are disputed. And they did it in a really violent way. They rounded people up. This is focused in California. They had a huge, basically like barbed wire fence surrounding people in a park in LA near Chavez Ravine, which they would then, of course, destroy in order to make the Dodgers Stadium, which is another reason to hate the Dodgers in addition to them abandoning Brooklyn. But it's not, I agree with David that given the current political climate, even if Donald Trump is elected president, which I don't think is going to happen, he's not going to do this. But it's not impossible that the political situation in this country could get to the point where somebody actually tries to do it.
Well, and even more recently, if you Google Postville, Iowa, and there was a huge mass deportation of mostly Guatemalan immigrants at a meatpacking plant there, and 2 Black Hawk helicopters going in Postville, Iowa, population what? A couple thousand. They ended up 10 shackling all of these workers at this meat packing plant. Are they violent criminals? No. They also did not allow any immigration attorneys to come and represent these folks. They slapped them all with criminal offenses, and they set up cattle grounds to hold them. It was actually an interpreter who finally went against the ethics of interpreting, translating to speak up against what was actually happening. This was in the, I think was it the 90s or early 2000s actually? Yeah, 2006 I think. So I would encourage you to look that up, but it is disturbing what has happened under in very recent history.
I think, but the climate, I think, is changing. I think you wouldn't be able to sell this. Well, first of all, to answer your question, their financial resources are not there. So I agree with both of you guys. It's true. It's just the money is not there. Even when some of my clients are afraid, they're like, well, I'm a U.S. citizen. I'm going to submit a petition for my wife. What if they come and pick her up? Because when you submit the application, you put your address, your phone number, where you live, and everything. You're submitting the application, so you're still undocumented. So technically, they could come and get you. But of course, they don't have the financial resources to come get you. But it would be really hard to sell something like this. You know, let's say he's elected, and how's he going to sell the story? Let's start to deport 11 million people. Just think of the way that's going to sound. Now, let's say whatever, he funds it himself, he's rich, he gets the financial resources to do this. But nowadays, I just think the climate, the way everything is, you know, with the media, TV, you know, Facebook and everything, think about Ferguson. Think of what happened, just one person who was, you know, shot, how people were so enraged, so angry. So think about it. If you tried to deport 11 million people, I mean, maybe that incident back then, maybe it was isolated. There were only a couple people that were deported back in the 1950s. You know, now I think just the climate has changed so much that people are more knowledgeable. I think I just would think we would have like Ferguson times, you know, 1 million if that were to happen. So that's just honestly what I think the reality is. And so I think him coming up to Congress and saying, oh, let's, you know, I have a new idea. Let's deport 11 million people. I just think that's not even financially feasible. And it's just not, it's just our climate, the way we are now. I think we're more educated, we're more knowledgeable, where I don't think people would just, you know, sit there and just watch 11 million people get deported. I just don't think it would
I think
happen.
thankfully the benefit is that our racial climate in the U.S. has changed. And so the proof will be in the pudding of who actually goes out and votes, and that the Latino vote is a powerful one, and will hopefully.
If they come, burn the cities.
So let's give an opportunity. I think there was we have other questions here. So what we want to do is we want to get through a few questions, but we also want to allow our panelists an opportunity to say a few words. And then I always like for, you know, the guests and those who are here, you know, in this room to have an opportunity to talk with the panelists and visit the table. So we want to provide time for that. So I see we have one question here. So let's do 1, 2, 3 questions, and then panelists, I may limit you to your responses so we can get in as many questions as we can amongst what we have left. Go ahead.
Hi. I just had a comment about, like, we're here trying to talk to Congress or, like, suggest to the government about immigration reform. But shouldn't we start looking into, like, the rich companies that, like, you mentioned, that they're the one basically giving out bait to the undocumented to like come here and try to be successful. Like that's the reason why I feel like we should start, instead of saying like, look, like tell Congress we don't need a pan like to deport. We need to start looking at the companies that hire the undocumented, because they're the ones that are like discriminating the voices or lowering the voices, because just want their own. Like I remember learning in history that there are people that there was a sign that said companies only want you for your hands, not your voices. Right. So should we start looking into policies that will like investigate those companies that use undocumented discreetly?
So
And
what can the country do in terms of legislation towards companies
Yes.
who are using undocumented?
Yes.
Stop buying their products. I mean,
Every company.
the difference is, I think, the reason why I'm talking about government is because I'm a political scientist, but also because at least there's some mechanism of accountability in theory for corporations. Unless you're going to become a shareholder and attend the meeting, you don't have that same accountability. So the answer is to not consume their products. Find out if it's Tyson who's exploiting people in southern chicken processing plants, and don't buy Tyson chicken. I can't say for certain. I sort of feel that way about Tyson, but I'm not sure. So I'm not, find out, do more research than I'm suggesting here. But I mean, I think that's the answer. It is in a system that's based on supply and demand. If their policies are not rewarded. But I mean, the other piece of that is, as I said, lower prices. This is all priced into the American economy. If you have to pay more for a hotel room because the person that makes your bed and scrubs the toilet is documented and makes minimum wage, for God's sake, I think there's the other side of that, is that there's this discount that's priced into it. But if people don't support companies that have bad records towards their employees, that might make people stand up and pay attention, rather than expect Congress to legislate, I mean, which has not proven to be particularly successful in terms of regulating.
So, and I know we got it, but on the heels of that, then does that create some type of economic downturn? If companies who are major contributors to the economic foundation of this country are not supported and their products are not bought, then what happens to the economy?
Well, I would say the 11 million people that are currently paying taxes indirectly would then become more direct taxpayers, and that there would be more revenue that would be generated. They're already paying property taxes by paying rent. They're already paying sales taxes as consumers. If you can price them into the federal income tax and state income tax and Social Security, you're going to be generating revenue. I don't think the question is we're going to force companies to go out of business and therefore that will create more unemployment and lower GDP growth. I think the answer is to make them accountable and change employment practices that are more humane. That shouldn't adversely impact the economy.
Which I actually think is impossible to do within our borders, because actually, I mean, successful companies like Google and others, they're actually fueling the high-tech jobs. Mm-hmm. They're importing immigrants mm-hmm. who are actually making quite a bit. If we're really going to address this issue, then we have to look at our foreign policy and why is it's okay that people are making all of our products that are sold in Walmart and Target.
So it's more export-import.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, that's where our prices are driven down, as well as labor here in the United States, which is a whole trafficking issue. But I think it goes much deeper than just simply Google and others.
And that's a very interesting point, in that it begs other questions. But I do want to get to these other questions so that we don't overlook them. So just
which part?
Either.
Is this on here? Oh, all right,
yes.
Cool. It sounds like immigrations, and I know this is an immigration panel, but it seems like immigration is a symptom of a larger issue or a set of larger issues. I was wondering if you could speak to what some of those issues would be. I've heard racism in failed states. I was wondering if there was maybe one we could like put a pin in and say, this is it. If we get this, we'll kill off immigration. That's idealistic. And if so, is that what we should be focusing? Is that what, like, is it America's duty to do so? And how could we go about doing that?
Abolish the nation state. We are all people, have one world, and also to go along with that, I think a capitalist economy is totally outdated, and we need to get rid of that too. And I think the problem with the companies is that they're based on exploitation. The people who can stop that are not consumers. It's people who make the products. It's the workers. And the standard of living of workers in the U.S. has gone down way more as a result of setting people off against each other than any discount we get from low-wage work, harvesting lettuce and stuff like that. Most people don't even stay in hotel rooms. I mean, I've only stayed in a hotel room like twice in my life. Right? It's essentially middle class and rich people who do that. Ordinary people usually are totally hurt by the way that bosses set immigrants against native-born people and use all these divisions against us. And I think the solution is ordinary working class people have to organize and make a fight to guarantee a decent standard of living for everybody. If every person in this country had the right to a job, had enough money to pay them, and to a decent education for their children and health care, it wouldn't be such a big deal. Who cares if somebody comes in and speaks a different language and looks kind of different from you? I mean, the Jews came here basically to get Chinese food in the first place. If they hadn't been here, then they would all not come. So, you get a lot of benefits from immigration if you don't have all these economic things setting people off against each other. That's my answer.
So Sam,
Nobody
when
else
do
will
you have
agree
your
with.
classes? When are your classes? Sonia, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I mean, I guess I'll just go back to what I said from my perspective. I think there's a lot of different factors, but I think from my role as an advocate, I think since I work for the organization, the YWCA, I think racism is something that's always an underlining issue in all the families that we work with. It's not solely the single issue, of course, but it's just a very complicated question. I'm not an attorney, I feel. I don't have much of the legal knowledge, but I think since I do work with these families on a daily basis, I think I could really see how they're affected and how their children are affected. And it's really not a way that families should live on a daily basis. So I think there's many factors that go into it. So I don't want to really pinpoint one issue.
Okay. Let's, if we have one other question, let's take one other question, and then we're going to let our panelists close us out with a minute each.
Yes, just a real quick question. I think it was, I forgot your name.
Catherine.
Catherine, you mentioned something about refugees as opposed to other categories of immigrants. And it seems to me that the definition of what is a refugee seems somewhat arbitrary. But a refugee would be allowed asylum as opposed to other categories. So like, how does the government define a refugee, and how is that differ from other categories, and why do they make these distinctions? Because to me it seems like everybody that is coming here to escape some kind of a impoverished or violent situation is a refugee, but then we sort of cherry pick and say, well, Syria, these are refugees, but then Haiti, these are boat people, and over here is another group that is, so these seem arbitrary lines in the sand, but would you speak to that maybe?
Yeah, it would seem. The characteristics of a person who's given the legal determination of a refugee, their story can be very similar to someone coming from Mexico who's not given that determination. So it is a legal determination from the Immigration and Nationality Act, which is the law that defines our immigration laws. I don't completely have it memorized. It's a person who's fled their home country because of for well-founded fear of persecution because of their race, religion, national origin, or membership in a political group. You cannot meet the definition of a refugee because of poverty. And it's UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, who gives that status. Also, consequently, there is not currently a UNHCR office in Latin America. So what does that say? In order to be resettled into another country as a refugee, you have to be given that legal determination by a UNHCR staff member. That's what gives you that status. So you may have fled to another country, and you may be labeled a refugee by the news, but you haven't been necessarily given that determination unless you've been issued it. So, and the U.S. accepts the most, 70,000 a year. And then you would think of asylum seekers are those folks, my layman's term is, you've applied for refugee status after the fact. So you've entered into the United States, maybe on a tourist visa, student visa, or illegally without status, and then you plead your asylum status, which is incredibly difficult, and Rosu could probably speak to that more. In our court system here, it's very difficult to apply for asylum status. So that is somewhat of the difference. So like my organization, we resettle those who've been given that legal determination, even though, but my department of serving many people from all over, I mean, I would say the folks that we see and help with the U visa process, or many of the young folks that came through the DACA program, when I asked them, how did you come into the United States? Many of the components of their stories were just as horrific, if not more, than some of our refugee clients that I talk with on a day-to-day basis. I don't know if that helps answer your question. Okay.
Okay, so there is a lot to be said here. This is a great discussion, and it needs to continue, and it will continue. I think our goal is to, first of all, bring the awareness to this discussion. And obviously, as you see, we have the resources, we have the ability to connect with professionals and those here at the college to continue this discussion. But what we would like to be able to do is give our panelists at least maybe about a minute in terms of your closing remarks. You know, definitely thank you for coming here. First of all, let's thank them for. Fantastic. Maybe give them about a minute each to, as a summary and your closing remarks on this discussion of immigration reform. And then if anything you can see in terms of a call to action, like what you think would be a next step beyond this conversation that we can do to further help, you know, to shed the right type of awareness on this discussion. And we'll start with Professor Goldberg.
I think we've talked about things at a bunch of different levels. I think we have practitioners who are dealing with this, right? As opposed to, we're talking about things in a more abstract or theoretical way. I think knowing that there are resources in the community that are doing this is really important, and I want to get contact information and talk about service learning so that students in my classes can work with World Relief. I think some of that is already occurring or can occur. I think, you know, because it's difficult when we talk about systematic kinds of structural issues on the world stage. Well, how can you as an individual affect that? Well, the kinds of things that are being talked about by the panelists, I think that's how you can affect that. And you can call manure when you smell it, right? When someone says something that just doesn't stand up to the smell test, respectfully and professionally, you can ask for the evidence to support the claim that you're going to humanely deport 12 million people. That kind of stuff doesn't make any sense. So I think, like a lot of my comments, and I think some of Sam's comments are, we're talking about things in a slightly different realm than the other people that are here, and we want to connect those, right? We want to take the sort of book learning, for lack of a better word, with the practitioners, the people that are improving people's lives, trying to improve people's lives on a daily basis, right? I mean, I think you see here, DuPage County, where we have human trafficking, where we have all of these other issues that are taking place. These are people that are working to do that on a daily basis. It's about being aware, it's about talking about it, and taking advantage of the resources that are around us. I mean, that's a start, right? Obviously, these are big structural problems that don't get fixed overnight, and one presidential election or 4 congressional elections are not going to fix immigration in the United States.
Thank you.
That's more than a minute.
Professor Matrani, if you would, please.
I don't have any easy advice that will help fix this problem, but I would say 2 quick things. One follows up on what David said, which is I think everybody should call bullshit if you see somebody implying that other people aren't really people. And I think that's kind of what all this boils down to. When somebody says we're going to deport 12 million people because they broke the law, this is implying like these aren't really people and we can do whatever to them. And you see that in many different elements of our society, and I think it's just a basic, almost human instinct to say that's just bullshit. And the other thing is, I think the more that people stand up to all the problems that we face, in fact, even the problems that you as individuals face, like half of you in this room as students are working for like $9 an hour at Target, well, that's messed up too. If you guys are able to fight for 30, which should be the minimum wage, then yeah, prices would go up a little. You'd make the profits go down, and you'd make the immigrants who are getting less than that $30 minimum wage get 20. So the more that people stand up to protect the things that they have and make a fight against the companies, which I think are stealing all the money and using this issue, the better off we all are.
Thank you. Sonia, if you would.
Sure. So I guess kind of in summary, so at the YWCA, we strive to empower all of the aspects of our clients' lives. As you know, we've all talked about immigration issues. Being undocumented is a form of oppression. I have the privilege of driving to work every day, and I don't have to fear deportation due to a basic traffic stop. So this is the reality of many of the families that are undocumented here in the United States. And as my fellow panelists have said, I think a great way to start is always to keep being informed, keep having these conversations with friends, family, coworkers. It's, as we've all noted today, it's a very complex issue, but I think by starting with ourselves, by understanding the issue more, by being more aware, it really helps other people that are around us and people that we care about or love or know. So it's a great way to start that way.
Catherine?
Yeah, I think just a couple things, just right in our own backyard in the state of Illinois, we don't have a state budget. And we typically, our organization, I mean, I know that YWCA has been affected by not having a state budget. That means a lot of our grant money is tied up in that state standoff. But one of them is we received a citizenship grant to help immigrants apply for U.S. citizenship, and that's on hold. And so we no longer can help people for free with that. And if you look at the amount, so immigrants make up 14% of the population in the state of Illinois, and yet like 0.03 of the state budget goes towards services for immigrants, and that's a problem. And so if you feel passionate about that, I would just encourage you to be calling your local legislators and the governor and speak up about that. And when you do advocacy, that could maybe seem like, oh, I don't know what to say when I call. They're not going to ask you why you think that. You can just say, hi, I'm a voting citizen, and this is what I think should happen. And so not just services for immigrants, but also services for mental health counseling and a lot of other areas right now that in the state of Illinois that are really hurting. The other thing I would say too is that if you hear of an immigration bill that is up, do your research and look at it, and then also then speak up with your U.S. congressman or woman and call their office. It does make a difference. So using your voice would be one. And then another thing is that if you don't know an immigrant, that make this issue more personal by trying to befriend one or volunteer and sort of because that's the best way to have this issue become live and sort of struggle with it more is when you have an actual person that you're in relationship with.
Thank you. And then Rocio.
Yeah, I agree. You know, being an immigration attorney, I love what I do. I have a passion for what I do. I love helping families, helping single family moms, get their green card when they're raising 5 children on their own. So I think, being educated and knowing and learning more about the issue. I don't think we can answer all of the questions we try to do, try to fix immigration issues here in this panel in 2 hours talking about it. But I think if you just make yourself, go out there and become more informed. And one thing I wanted to that I was agreeing was about, I'm glad actually that Donald Trump spoke the way he did about certain minorities, because I think that's raising a lot of awareness. I have a lot of clients who are just legal permanent residents, and they just don't renew their, they don't become citizens, because you have to become a citizen in order to be able to vote. And they just have left it, I don't know, just renew it every 10 years, and they don't want to apply for citizenship for whatever reason. But I think this is now, bringing up some fire in them. It's like, how can you talk about me like this? How can you talk about people that I know? Maybe not me, but maybe my parents, maybe my grandparents. So I think it's just bringing a lot of knowledge. Actually, I want to thank him for doing this, for speaking this way, so people can now, this, I think, prompting people to become citizens, and now maybe they can have a voice. People will ask me, well, do you want a Republican? Do you want a Democrat? I really don't care. Because of what I do, I just want someone who can help us with immigration reform get it through. That's all I really care. So I think it's good if you could just get yourself informed, and if you can help and volunteer in the citizenship applications that Catherine's going to be having hopefully in the future once we have a budget, that'd be great.
Thank you again to our panelists. But without these panelists. Obviously, it would not be possible to have this great discussion, but we do want to thank you all who have had the opportunity to participate in this. This was put together by a collaborative effort, and so we need to recognize those who have been a part of putting this particular panel and this discussion together. To Stephanie Quirk and the Office of Student Life. Stephanie? Sarah Liz Jimenez and the Latino Outreach Center. My name is David Swope with the Center for Student Diversity and Inclusion, and thank you. And it was good to have this discussion. There is more to come. They kind of outlined some of the next steps. There is information that we need to look into. I will say this, don't assume, research. Don't stereotype. Do more fact-finding so that we can have a meaningful, informed conversation. Out of the conversation, we can derive better steps, and we'll continue to bring these types of panels and discussions to you to raise awareness about issues like this. For our students, if you need to sign up for credit or Live-in Leadership Program, the sign-up sheet is back there. I encourage you all to come up and shake the hand of our panelists and maybe stop by the table on your way out. Thank you, and have a great day.